The unsettling delivery. Alex had been a delivery driver for 3 months now. He was used to making deliveries in the middle of the day and late at night, sometimes to the most unusual places. But today felt different. It was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the horizon. The orange glow in the sky cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood. Alex was almost done with his shift, and there was just one more delivery to make. He glanced at the address on the receipt. It was a small house on the corner of Maple Street. Nothing special about it, just an old 2-story house surrounded by a few tall trees. But something about it caught his attention. He had delivered to this house a few times before, but today there was something strange about it. The curtains in the window were drawn, but there was a small gap in one of them, as if someone was watching him. Alex shook off the feeling. He had no time to waste thinking about it. He grabbed the pizza box and headed for the door. As he approached the front step, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. This wasn't unusual, but it felt off. Normally, people would open the door when they saw him approach, but today, the woman who lived there, an elderly lady, hadn't greeted him yet. Alex rang the doorbell, his finger pressing firmly on the button. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, but there was no response. He waited for a moment, but still, nothing. He was about to knock when he noticed movement through the small gap in the curtain. A pair of eyes appeared, watching him closely. They were dark and steady, unblinking. Alex froze for a second, unsure of what to do. The woman had always seemed nice before, but today, her gaze made him feel uneasy. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and the elderly woman appeared. She was dressed in an old faded robe, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her skin was pale, and her eyes seemed tired, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Hello," Alex said, trying to sound friendly. "I have your pizza." The woman didn't smile or greet him warmly, as she usually did. Instead, she simply nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Her movements were slow and stiff, like someone who had been sitting still for too long. Alex handed her the pizza box, but she didn't take it right away. Instead, she stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Alex asked, sensing something was wrong. The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, looking at him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. There was something off about the way she was standing, as if she were trying to hold herself together, but failing. "I'm fine," she said quietly, finally taking the pizza box from him. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was something about it that made Alex feel even more uncomfortable. Alex took a small step back, not sure if he should leave or if he should try to ask her if everything was okay. As he moved to turn around, the woman spoke again. "You didn't see anything strange today, did you?" Her voice was almost pleading, but her eyes were still locked on his, searching his face for any sign of recognition. Alex hesitated. "What do you mean?" he asked, confused. The woman's grip on the pizza box tightened. "It's important. You didn't see anything out of place." "No, ma'am," Alex replied, his heart beginning to race. "I didn't see anything strange. Everything seems fine." The woman's face softened a little, but the tension in the air didn't go away. She nodded slowly, as though she was relieved. "Good," she whispered. Then, before Alex could say another word, she closed the door. Alex stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. Something didn't feel right. Why had she asked him that? And why had she looked at him with such intensity? As he walked back to his car, he glanced back at the house. The curtains were drawn again, and the house seemed quiet. But the feeling of unease stuck with him. Something about that interaction had felt wrong. Was he overthinking it? Maybe it was just the end of a long shift playing tricks on his mind. He shook his head and got into his car, starting the engine. But as he pulled away from the house, he couldn't help but glance in his rearview mirror. The windows were dark, but he could have sworn he saw a shadow move inside. His mind raced as he drove off, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. What had just happened? Was it just his imagination, or had there really been something strange about the way the woman had acted? Alex couldn't help but wonder, what had she been trying to hide? The hidden truth. The following day, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His shift started like any other, but his mind kept drifting back to that strange encounter with the elderly woman. He tried to focus on his deliveries, but it was as if her tired eyes and her eerie question, "You didn't see anything strange, did you?" kept echoing in his head. By the time he finished his deliveries, he had convinced himself that it had just been an odd moment, nothing more. Maybe the woman was just a little confused, maybe tired. He had no real reason to suspect anything more. But deep down, a part of him knew that he couldn't just forget it. On his way home, Alex decided to take a different route, passing by the elderly woman's house again. As he approached, he couldn't resist the pull to stop and take a closer look. The house seemed just as quiet as the day before, but this time, the curtains were pulled open, just a little. He parked a few houses down, his curiosity getting the best of him. He didn't intend to do anything out of the ordinary, but there was something about the woman's strange behavior that made him feel like he had missed something important. He sat in his car for a few moments, watching the house. There was no movement, no sign of life, yet the feeling of unease gnawed at him. He thought about how odd it had been that she hadn't offered to pay for the pizza. He remembered how her hands had shaken as she took the pizza box, and how she had insisted he hadn't seen anything strange. Suddenly, Alex's eyes widened as he noticed something unusual. The house's back door, which he hadn't seen before, was slightly ajar. It was strange because the back of the house was out of sight from the street, hidden behind a tall fence. No one ever used that door. It was just a back entrance. Was this a sign that something was wrong? He wasn't sure, but his gut told him he couldn't ignore it. Without thinking, Alex got out of his car and walked cautiously down the street, staying close to the shadows of the trees lining the sidewalk. He didn't know what he expected to find, but something told him that he couldn't leave without knowing what was going on in that house. As he neared the back fence, he crouched down behind some bushes, peering through a gap in the wood. He saw nothing at first, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he spotted a figure standing near the back door, another woman. This woman was younger than the elderly woman, with long dark hair and wearing a black hoodie. She seemed to be looking around, as if she was waiting for someone. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. What was she doing there? Was she connected to the elderly woman? His heart raced as he watched. The woman didn't seem to notice him, and after a few moments, she stepped inside, disappearing from view. Alex took a deep breath. It was now or never. He knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to find out more. Slowly, he made his way to the back door. The crack in the door was still wide enough for him to slip inside. He hesitated for a moment, looking over his shoulder. The neighborhood was quiet. No one seemed to be watching. He pushed the door open just enough to step inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was dark, lit only by dim light filtering through the small windows. Alex tried to be as quiet as possible, but his footsteps seemed deafening in the silence. He walked down the narrow hallway, glancing around nervously. Then he heard something, a faint sound coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. It sounded like voices, a man and a woman. Alex moved closer, careful not to make a sound. He stopped in his tracks when he heard the words clearly, the elderly woman's voice. But this time, it was different. It was sharp, demanding, not the quiet, tired voice he had heard yesterday. "You need to get out of here," the elderly woman said urgently. "They can't find out." Then a man's voice responded, low and threatening. "I don't care who finds out. You're in this with me now. We have to finish what we started." Alex froze, his pulse racing. This was not what he had expected. What was going on in this house? And why was this man threatening the elderly woman? What kind of secret was she hiding? He moved a little closer, straining to hear the conversation. But before he could catch more, the door to the room creaked open. Alex quickly stepped back into the shadows, holding his breath. He pressed himself against the wall, praying that he wouldn't be noticed. Through the small gap in the door, he saw the woman in the hoodie again. She was holding something small, wrapped in cloth. She slipped it into her bag and turned to leave. Alex's heart was hammering in his chest as he watched her exit the house. But as she passed by the doorway, she stopped suddenly, looking in his direction. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Alex felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman's eyes were cold, unblinking. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked away. Alex stood there, motionless, for a few more seconds before the adrenaline hit him. He had to leave now. He quickly stepped back toward the door, heart still racing. Whatever was going on in this house, it was bigger than he had imagined. As Alex left the house and stepped back into the street, the reality of what he had just witnessed sank in. Something was terribly wrong, and he had just uncovered a secret that could change everything. What had he gotten himself into? The dangerous secret. Alex couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. He kept replaying the events in his mind, but nothing made sense. What had the elderly woman and the young woman been discussing in that room? Who was the man she was talking to, and why was the elderly woman so terrified? As Alex walked back to his car, he felt the weight of the secret he had uncovered pressing down on him. He wasn't sure why, but something told him he couldn't walk away from this. His gut was telling him that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was something dangerous going on in that house. He reached his car and sat inside, staring at the empty street in front of him. He could have driven away, gone home, and forgotten about the whole thing. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in too deep now, that the story he had stumbled into was more than just a coincidence. After a few minutes, Alex started his engine. He needed to know more. He had to find out what was really going on. But where to start? The elderly woman seemed like the key to the mystery, but how could he confront her without sounding crazy? How could he even get her to trust him? Alex knew he couldn't just knock on her door and ask her what was happening. He needed to be smart about this. He decided to do some research. The next morning, Alex did some digging. He found out that the elderly woman, whose name was Mrs. Doris Jenkins, had lived in the neighborhood for years. She was known as a quiet, reclusive woman who kept to herself. Neighbors had always said she was a little odd, but no one had ever suspected anything out of the ordinary. There were no records of her having any family, and no one really knew much about her past. That only made the mystery more intriguing. Why was she so secretive? Why did she act so nervous when Alex delivered the pizza? It wasn't long before Alex uncovered another detail that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Jenkins had recently been involved in a legal dispute. A property development company had been trying to buy her house, but she had refused to sell. The company had offered her a large sum of money, but she had turned them down flat. The more Alex read, the more it seemed like the property developers were determined to take her house by any means necessary. But what did that have to do with the man and the young woman Alex had seen at her house? Were they somehow connected to the property developers? Was Mrs. Jenkins being threatened? The answers were just out of reach, but Alex could feel he was getting closer. He had to be careful. He didn't know who he was dealing with, and he didn't want to put himself in danger. Later that day, Alex drove back to the neighborhood. He parked a few streets away from Mrs. Jenkins' house, trying to keep a low profile. He didn't want anyone to notice him. He knew he was pushing his luck by returning, but he couldn't stop himself. He needed more answers. He sat in his car, watching the house carefully. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. The curtains were drawn, the front door was locked, and there was no sign of anyone. But then, as the sun began to set, Alex saw something that made his heart race. A black car pulled up in front of the house. A man stepped out, dressed in a suit. He looked around quickly before walking up to the door and knocking. Alex's heart skipped a beat. Was this the man who had been speaking to Mrs. Jenkins? Was he the one threatening her? Alex waited in the shadows, trying to stay hidden. He watched the man speak to someone inside the house, but he couldn't hear the conversation. After a few minutes, the man entered, and the door was shut behind him. Alex was about to leave, but then he noticed something even more unsettling. A car pulled into the driveway. Another black car, this time with tinted windows. A woman got out, wearing a dark hoodie. She was the same woman Alex had seen the other night, the one with the cold, unblinking stare. Why was she back here? What was going on? Alex's pulse quickened as he watched her walk toward the door, knocking firmly. He had to know what was happening inside. He couldn't just sit there and watch. He crept closer to the house, his heart pounding in his chest. As he neared the front door, he heard raised voices. It sounded like an argument. Alex couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The door opened briefly, and Alex saw the elderly woman and the young woman standing in the doorway, speaking urgently. Before Alex could get any closer, the door slammed shut again. He froze, trying to decide what to do next. He had to know what they were talking about. Whatever it was important. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind. If he couldn't hear what was happening inside, maybe he could find out another way. He looked around for an alternative. There was a small window on the side of the house, near the kitchen. If he could get close enough, he might be able to peek inside. He moved quietly, taking care not to alert anyone to his presence. As he neared the window, he held his breath. He saw movement inside. Mrs. Jenkins was talking to the young woman, but Alex couldn't hear their words. He strained his eyes, trying to make sense of what was going on. Then, just as Alex thought he might learn something crucial, the woman turned toward the window, her eyes catching his. For a second, they stared at each other through the glass. Alex's heart stopped. She knew he was there, the hidden truth. Alex's heart pounded as he stood frozen by the window, staring at the woman. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her cold, calculating gaze felt like it pierced straight through him. Alex quickly ducked behind a bush, trying to remain unseen. He was sure she had noticed him, but he couldn't take the chance of getting caught. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Alex held his breath, waiting for the woman to leave the window, but she didn't move. He could feel his pulse racing in his ears. He had to act fast. After what felt like hours, Alex decided he couldn't stay hidden any longer. He was already too deep into this mystery. If he was going to uncover the truth, he couldn't back down now. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then slowly crept toward the front door. Just as he reached for the door handle, it opened with a creak. Alex froze, his heart nearly stopping. It was Mrs. Jenkins, her frail figure standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she saw him, and for a split second, Alex thought she might slam the door in his face. Instead, Mrs. Jenkins looked over her shoulder, her expression anxious. The young woman had emerged from inside the house, her eyes narrowing when she saw Alex standing there. Without saying a word, Mrs. Jenkins stepped back, allowing Alex to enter. "Why are you here?" Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here." I need to know what's going on," Alex stammered. "I've seen too much. I know you're in danger." Mrs. Jenkins glanced nervously at the young woman, who stepped closer. The young woman's cold eyes scanned Alex, and he could feel the tension building between them. He had no idea who she was, but he could tell she was trouble. "You don't understand," the woman said, her voice low and menacing. "This is bigger than you think. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Alex swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a small neighborhood mystery anymore. There was something much darker going on, and Alex had stumbled right into the middle of it. He needed answers, but he didn't know who to trust. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward, her hands shaking. "Please, you need to leave now. It's too dangerous for you." But Alex refused to back down. "I can't leave. Not until I know the truth." The young woman let out a sharp laugh, her eyes flickering with amusement. "Truth? There's no truth here, just lies and danger. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Alex's mind raced. What was she talking about? What lies? And who exactly was this woman? She clearly knew more than she was letting on. It was as if she was trying to scare him off. But Alex wasn't the type to run away from danger. Not now. "I'm not leaving until I know what's going on," Alex said, his voice firm. "Tell me everything. Why are you so afraid of these people? What's the truth?" The young woman exchanged a glance with Mrs. Jenkins. It was clear they were both weighing their options, deciding whether to reveal more or send him away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Mrs. Jenkins spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "They've been watching me. They've been threatening me for weeks. They want my house, but it's more than that. They'll stop at nothing to get it." Alex's mind raced. "Who are they? Who wants your house?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know their names. They're powerful people. They've sent people to intimidate me, to make me sell. But I can't. This house, it's all I have left." The young woman stepped forward, her face softening slightly. "They think we're weak. They think they can scare us into giving up. But they're wrong." Alex felt a sense of urgency rise in his chest. He had no idea what kind of people Mrs. Jenkins was dealing with, but it was clear they were ruthless. Whatever they wanted from her, they weren't going to stop until they got it. Just then, Alex heard a noise coming from the street. Tires screeched, and a black car pulled up to the curb. The windows were tinted, and Alex couldn't see who was inside, but he knew it was trouble. The young woman's expression darkened, and she quickly motioned for Alex to move toward the back of the house. "Go now," she whispered urgently. "You have to leave. It's too dangerous." Alex didn't need to be told twice. He followed her lead, slipping through the side gate and into the backyard. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make himself as quiet as possible. But as they rounded the corner, he caught a glimpse of two men stepping out of the black car. They were tall, imposing, and dressed in dark suits. "Who are they?" Alex whispered. "They're the ones who've been threatening Mrs. Jenkins," the young woman said, her voice filled with fear. "They're here to make her sell, one way or another." Alex felt a surge of anger. This was no longer just a case of curiosity. It was a battle for Mrs. Jenkins' life, and Alex wasn't going to let these men get away with it. He turned to the young woman, his mind made up. "We need to stop them." The unlikely alliance. Alex's heart raced as he followed the young woman through the backyard. The sight of the two men in suits was enough to send a shiver down his spine. They were exactly the type of people you didn't want to cross. But Alex wasn't ready to back down. Not when he knew Mrs. Jenkins' life was at stake. As they reached the back gate, the young woman grabbed Alex's arm. Her grip was firm, but there was a hint of desperation in her eyes. "We need to move fast. If they catch us, it's over." Alex nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Who are they? What do they want?" She glanced over her shoulder toward the men, who were now making their way toward the front door. "They work for a man named Vincent King. He's the one behind all of this. He wants Mrs. Jenkins' house, but it's more than that. He's after something she has, something valuable." Alex's mind whirled. What's in the house that's so valuable? The young woman hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know exactly. But whatever it is, it's important to him. If we don't stop him now, he'll get his hands on it, and it will be too late." Alex's mind was racing, piecing together the puzzle. He had stumbled into something much bigger than a simple delivery. He had no idea what kind of people these were, but he knew one thing for sure. They were dangerous, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. We can't just sit back and wait, Alex said, determination in his voice. What do we do? The young woman's eyes hardened. We have to get to the house first. If we can find out what Vincent King is really after, maybe we can stop him before it's too late. But we have to hurry. Alex nodded. He had no idea what they were going to find inside Mrs. Jenkins' house, but he was ready to face whatever came their way. He had already seen enough to know that these people were willing to go to extreme lengths to get what they wanted. As they moved through the alley behind Mrs. Jenkins' house, Alex could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. They were being hunted by dangerous men, and time was running out. The young woman stopped suddenly, her hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes darting around. "They're coming." Alex froze. He could hear the sound of footsteps echoing in the alley. The two men in suits were closing in. There was no time to waste. "Through here," the young woman urged, pulling Alex into a small side door that led into a narrow hallway. They were inside the house now, but the danger wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. They moved quickly through the dimly lit corridor, trying to avoid making any noise. Every step felt like it echoed through the silence. Alex's heart was pounding in his chest as they approached the main living room. "Mrs. Jenkins," Alex whispered, hoping to find her before the men did. "Where is she?" "She's upstairs," the young woman replied, her voice tight. "But we don't have much time. They'll be here soon." Alex nodded, his mind already focused on the task at hand. They had to find whatever Vincent King was after and get out before it was too late. They reached the staircase, but just as they were about to climb, Alex heard the sound of voices. The two men were close, their footsteps echoing in the hallway below. "We have to move," Alex urged. "We'll have to find another way." The young woman turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "No, we have to go upstairs. It's the only way." With no time to argue, Alex followed her up the stairs. The house creaked under their weight as they made their way to the second floor. They passed several rooms, but the young woman led him straight to a small, locked door at the end of the hall. She turned to Alex, her face serious. "This is it. Whatever Vincent King is looking for, it's behind this door." Alex's mind was racing. What could be behind that door that was so important? And why had Mrs. Jenkins kept it locked all this time? The young woman pulled a small key from her pocket and unlocked the door. It creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was thick with dust, and a faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Alex stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. There was nothing particularly special about it, just a few old boxes, a dusty bookshelf, and a table covered with papers. But there was one thing that stood out, a small ornate box sitting on the table. The young woman walked over to the table and picked up the box. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "This is what they've been after." Alex's breath caught in his throat. The box was beautiful, but it seemed almost out of place in the dingy room. It was intricately carved with designs Alex didn't recognize, and there was a strange, almost magnetic energy emanating from it. "What is it?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The young woman shook her head. "I don't know, but I've seen the way Vincent King looks at it. He'll do anything to get his hands on it, and if we don't stop him, he'll destroy everything." Just then, they heard the sound of footsteps coming from downstairs. The men were getting closer. They didn't have much time. "We need to leave now," Alex urged, his heart racing. But as they turned to leave the room, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. The men were here. "The chase begins." The loud crash echoed through the house like thunder. Alex's heart raced as he spun toward the door, the sound of heavy footsteps growing louder with each passing second. His pulse hammered in his ears, and the room seemed to close in around him. The two men were getting closer. "Quick," the young woman hissed, her voice tight with panic. She grabbed the small ornate box, clutching it to her chest. We have to go now, or we'll never make it out. Alex's mind raced as he scanned the room, looking for any escape route. The only option was through the hallway, but that meant going straight into the path of the men chasing them. There was no way out through the front. The back door was locked, and the side alley was too dangerous. Suddenly, he remembered the old attic staircase at the end of the hall. It was small and narrow, but it might be their only hope. Upstairs, he said quickly, grabbing her wrist. Follow me. They dashed toward the narrow attic stairs just as the door to the hallway burst open. Alex heard the voices of the two men just behind them, but there was no time to think. They had to move. The young woman stumbled as she ran, but Alex was there to steady her. Together, they made it to the attic stairs, breathing heavily. Alex climbed as fast as he could, urging her to follow. The attic was cramped and filled with old, dusty furniture covered in white sheets. The dim light from a single bulb overhead barely illuminated the space. Alex rushed to the far corner of the attic and found a small window. "Can you squeeze through there?" he asked, his voice tight. The young woman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I think so." As she made her way toward the window, Alex heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. The men were getting closer. They had to hurry. "I'll go first," Alex said, quickly checking the window. It was small, but just big enough for one person to slip through. With a final glance over his shoulder, Alex climbed up to the window and squeezed his way out onto the narrow ledge outside. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked down at the ground far below. There was no turning back now. The young woman followed close behind, her hand gripping his as she climbed through the window. The ledge was narrow, and the drop was terrifying, but there was no other choice. They had to escape. "I'll go first," Alex said again, taking the lead. He carefully made his way across the narrow ledge, his body pressed against the side of the house. The wind howled around them, making the air feel even colder. Behind him, the young woman was just as cautious, but Alex could hear the anxiety in her breathing. "We're almost there," he whispered, "just a little farther." The men were still inside the house, but their footsteps had become muffled, as if they were searching for another way out. It was only a matter of time before they realized Alex and the young woman had escaped through the window. Suddenly, Alex heard a sharp noise behind him. He whipped around, just in time to see one of the men from inside the house step out onto the ledge. The man's eyes locked onto Alex's, and for a brief moment, there was a deadly silence. "Not so fast," the man sneered, his voice cold with menace. Alex's stomach churned with fear, but he knew they couldn't stop now. If they did, it was over. "We can't outrun him," the young woman whispered urgently. "We have to outsmart him." Alex's mind raced as he searched for any advantage. He noticed that the man was slowly advancing, trying to close the gap. But if they could reach the corner of the building, there was a ladder that led down to the ground. It wasn't far, but they had to move fast. Without another word, Alex started moving again, pushing himself harder, his muscles screaming in protest. He glanced back to see the man following, but the distance between them was narrowing. "Come on," Alex urged, grabbing the young woman's hand and pulling her forward. They reached the corner just as the man lunged, his fingers barely grazing the young woman's ankle. But she managed to pull free, just in time for Alex to swing around the corner and grab the ladder. With one final, desperate push, Alex scrambled down the ladder, his hands burning from the effort. They hit the ground hard, but they didn't stop. Without looking back, they ran, their feet pounding against the cold pavement. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them, but Alex didn't dare glance over his shoulder. "We're almost there," the young woman gasped, her face pale but determined. "Just a few more blocks." The hidden truth. They kept running through the dark alleyways, their feet pounding the cold pavement. Alex's chest tightened with every breath, his muscles burning from the exertion. He could hear the sound of distant sirens now, but that didn't reassure him. It only made him more nervous. They were far from safe. The men who had chased them were still out there, and Alex knew that the worst was yet to come. "We need to get to the safe house," the young woman urged, her voice strained. She was barely keeping up with him, but she was determined. "It's the only place where we'll be able to hide and figure out what's going on." Alex didn't argue. He knew she was right. But the streets were dark and empty, the silence hanging heavy in the air. Every step felt like they were walking into an even bigger trap. They turned a corner and ducked into another narrow alley, hoping to lose any pursuers. The young woman glanced nervously over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't keep running forever," she said, her voice shaking. "They're going to catch us eventually." Alex could see the fear in her eyes, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. They needed answers, and the safe house was their best chance. If they could get there, they could figure out the next steps. The problem was, they weren't the only ones who knew about the safe house. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Do you trust me?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I do, but we don't have much time." With no time to waste, they continued down the alley, staying as quiet as possible. Alex's thoughts were racing. The box that the young woman was carrying, it was important. He didn't know exactly why, but something about it felt like the key to everything. It was like the box held the answers they were desperately searching for, but it was also the reason they were being hunted. The young woman suddenly stopped, her body tense. Alex followed her gaze and froze. There at the end of the alley stood a figure in the shadows. The figure was tall, wearing a long coat, and the faint glow from a street lamp revealed the unmistakable outline of a weapon. "Get down," Alex whispered urgently. They crouched low behind a stack of crates, holding their breath. Alex could hear the soft footsteps of the man as he moved closer. His heart raced. They were cornered. There was no way out. But just as the man took another step toward them, a loud screech of tires echoed through the alley. A car sped down the street, headlights blinding the man for a split second. In that moment, Alex grabbed the young woman's arm and pulled her toward a side entrance to an old building. They made it inside, hearts pounding. The door slammed behind them, and for a moment, they stood there, gasping for air, trying to collect their thoughts. "This isn't the safe house," Alex whispered, looking around. The building was empty, the floors covered in dust. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. "No," the young woman said softly, "but it's close. We need to move quickly. The safe house is only a few blocks away." Just as she finished speaking, Alex heard the screech of tires again, this time much closer. The men were still on their trail. "Now what?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. "We run," she said, determination flashing in her eyes. "And we don't stop until we're safe." They darted through the building, finding a hidden exit at the back. The moment they stepped out, Alex knew it was a race against time. They were so close, but the danger was real, and the men hunting them weren't far behind. The young woman held the box tightly, her fingers trembling. She was scared, but Alex could see the strength in her eyes. She wasn't just running for her life. She was running for something bigger, something that could change everything. But Alex still didn't know what it was. With every step, Alex could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The answers lay in that box, but first, they had to make it to the safe house. As they made their way through the darkened streets, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The men had been too close before, too persistent. They wouldn't stop chasing them until they had that box, and the young woman knew it. Just then, Alex's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat as he saw an unknown number flash on the screen. "Answer it," the young woman whispered, her eyes scanning the area. With shaking hands, Alex pressed the green button. The voice on the other end was low, almost a growl. You think you're going to make it to that safe house? The man's voice said coldly. We'll find you before you get there. You can't hide forever. Alex's stomach dropped. They were running out of time. And with each step they took,